Hello. The year for this video is 1921, the very beginning of 1921, the 2nd of January, and the place where it was written was the Villa Alam. So I finally learned the name of Grand Duke Andrei's villa, and it's spelled A-L-A-M. So hopefully I am pronouncing it correctly. So the reason these various Grand Dukes and Russian aristocrats have these villas in the south of France is simply because it's property that they bought before the revolution, and Dmitri did not have a villa in the south of France. He'd been quite a young man and a bachelor when the revolution broke out. So it's not surprising that he didn't have one. That was more something you would do once you had a family and had settled into whatever career you would have in the military or elsewhere. And yeah, he wasn't at that stage of his life at the time that the war broke out. So it's quite a long and in some ways complicated diary entry today, which is a good thing. We learn a lot from this diary entry, and it sort of focuses on part of it, the whole rationale for Dmitri's visit to the south of France, which is to talk about what to do about the documents produced by the Sokolov investigation. Okay, and we have quite a few introductions to make, and I would say overall you can judge for yourself that this was quite a good day for Dmitri, that he enjoyed himself, despite the serious aspect of it. All right, so let's dive in. At 11 o'clock, Maria, Gulia, the Polovtsovs, and I went to Divine Liturgy in Nice. It turns out there are two churches there, the little one that I had gone to in the fall, and a big one that is called a cathedral. There were tons of people, and the service was particularly good. We were late to liturgy and just made it before the end. Entering the cathedral, Maria approached Andrei and Malia. She approached Andrei and Malia, who stood with very sheepish faces off to the side, and that gesture apparently very much pleased Andrei. Maria, Gulia, and I lunched with the Tolstoys. Naturally, Zinotchka cried while telling me how much Pierre loved me and how much he had wanted to go to me in Persia. In the afternoon, Maria and I and Pete Polovtsov went to Antibes to see Nicholas Nikolayevich, or rather, I went to see him alone, and Maria and Pete waited for me and amused themselves. Nikolasha received me immediately, and we had quite a long conversation, which included Petyusha and Stana as well. But then she ran to her father in the hospital, and we three started discussing a topic of great interest to me, i.e. the Sokolov affair. I laid out my views on the matter, outlined the unfortunate situation of the affair at the moment, and related my and Andrei's idea about forming a committee consisting of Orlov, Kochubay, Old Putyatin, and the two of us. Nikolasha agreed to everything and even accepted the idea of concealing the matter in a monastic school. The main conversation was about who will be able to blank this matter back to Russia and under what circumstances. Here Petyusha proposed something stupid, to wit, that somehow his return should be tied to the will and authority. Somehow this return should be tied to the will and authority of the Patriarch. And with that, our conversation ended. Not a word was said about politics. Both brothers treated me very well and took me seriously, so much so that at moments it struck me as a little funny. I left Nikolasha's place around 5:30, found Maria and Pete, and we headed back to Monte Carlo. I dined at Andrei's place on the Cap d'Ale. He came while I was taking a bath and drove me back to his place. I felt pretty awkward along the way because Andrei, with tears in his eyes, proclaimed his love for me and asked that we never argue. Dinner was quite pleasant, except that Malichka tried too hard to lead me like a little lamb, but I was more careful with her than the first time, thank God. Wow, okay, lots to say about this one. So before we get to the meat of it, let's start with church. That was a Sunday, and let's start with church that morning in Nice. So it kind of drives me nuts, I have to admit, when I'm reading novels or other works about Russian history, when I'm reading translations of great novels like Dostoevsky novels, or when I'm reading books, whether scholarly or popular, on Russian history, that translators and authors uniformly use the word mass. And within Orthodoxy, we don't use the word mass. We use the word liturgy, the Greek word, which means the work of the people. If I'm not mistaken, doesn't sound like the work of the people, but I'm sure that's what I've been told at any rate, liturgia. So, but whether that's true or not, it's not the word that's used within the Orthodox world. And when you use the word mass, so you're thinking no big deal, but when you use the word mass in a translation, it really sort of perpetuates this idea that the Orthodox Church is just a slightly more exotic form of Roman Catholicism, and that there's not any big theological differences, aside from the part that, aside from the fact that the Orthodox Church does not accept the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. But nothing could be further from the case. So Orthodox see Protestants and Catholics as being the same side, or different sides of the same coin, and close together in some ways in theology, in ways that the Orthodox Church is far apart from both the Roman Catholic and the Protestant tradition. So that's a pet peeve of mine. It has nothing to do with Dmitri. Okay, so while they're in the church, I don't know if it was a special occasion. Pretty sure it wasn't Russian Christmas yet, although it was getting close. So yeah, while they're in the church, they come at the end of the service, and that is not is not a surprising thing. People tend to come and go from Orthodox services, although it drives the priests nuts, and they're always sort of requesting that people not do that. But they get there late. I'm assuming they're not taking communion because they haven't gone to confession. And even as they come in at this late moment in the service, Maria approaches Andrei and Malia Ksashinska, who, as Dmitri says, stood there with very sheepish faces. And it's not surprising that they were standing, because people stand during Orthodox services. And the fact that she approached them was quite significant, because there had been this ongoing feud where Malia was extremely offended that Maria would not receive her or Andrei because they were living in sin, so to speak, whereas she was happy to spend time with Gavrusha, Prince Gavril, and his former mistress, because they, unlike Andrei and Malia, had gotten married. Well, I'm not sure. I should have looked to see when Andrei and Malia got married, because they did eventually. But whether they're married or not, Marie is now willing to accept them. And so she makes this gesture in the church. And I'm thinking, good Lord, I really should have looked this up. I'm thinking that they would not have been in the church together, Andrei and Malia, if they were living as man and wife without being married. So, yeah, they must have gotten married, although so odd that Dmitri wouldn't have mentioned it. All right, well, we'll have to look into that later. So it seems like, as we saw last time, it seems like Gulia is now back to being okay as part of the group and not sort of refusing to talk to Dmitri and that sort of thing. And so we have the reintroduction of the Tolstoys. And in the meantime, since the last time Dmitri went to visit them, I have done a little research because my notes didn't really have anything about them. And when I was taking those notes, a person couldn't just go online and find out about people. Unfortunately, that was not a thing yet. So now I was able to learn a little bit about them. And at first I was very excited because we know from what Dmitri says in this diary entry, that Pyotr, or Pierre as Dmitri calls him, is referred to in the past tense by his wife. Zinочка cried while telling me how much Pierre loved me and how much he had wanted to go to me in Persia, and she's talking about him as though he were no longer among the living and couldn't express these feelings to Dmitri himself. And she's crying as she says it. So I was quite excited because when I looked for a Pyotr Tolstoy from the right time period and someone who'd been killed in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, I found this extremely impressive person, Pyotr Petrovich Tolstoy, who had attended Moscow University and obtained degrees in both physics and law, and was a public activist and a member of the Duma. And I thought, wow, that's impressive if this is the Pierre Tolstoy who had been so attached to Dmitri. Well, alas, no. This was another Pyotr Tolstoy, and he was called Pyotr Sergeyevich, and he had been attached as a military officer to Dmitri's household beginning in 1912. So they would have been together, throughout the war for several years. And this certainly explains why there was this apparently close bond between the two men, and why Pyotr, or Pierre, had deep affection for Dmitri, so much so that when Dmitri was exiled after the Rasputin assassination and before the Russian Revolution, Pierre had wanted to go and join him on the Persian front. And why he hadn't, I don't know. It would have been, I guess, defying the Tsar's wishes to have done so. And also, since he was a military man, he had duty to contribute to the war effort. So maybe that's why. But it also explains why Dmitri was going to visit Zinочка, whom he clearly found a little annoying at this stage of her existence, because she can't talk to him without crying. And he said in the previous diary that he thought that was probably quite bad for her children. She had 2 children. One of them was a daughter. I'm not sure if the other was a daughter or a son and what ages they were. But anyway, as much as it is annoying and probably a little disturbing for him to go and see Zinочка and think about these things, about Pyotr's death and all of that, he does go and see her. And he I'm sure rightly understands it as his duty to go and see her, since Pierre was a part of his household. All right, and so what happens after this? Here's where we get to the meat of the matter. So the three of them, Maria, Pete Polovtsov, and Dmitri, go off to Antibes. And the purpose of that visit is to visit Grand Duke, or is for Dmitri to have a conversation with Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolayevich, a serious conversation. So Maria certainly knew Nikolasha, but she is not going on this visit. Apparently she didn't know him well enough, or wasn't enough attached to him, that even though he was a member of the family, she wasn't going to go and say hello and have a tearful reunion, seeing him for the first time after the revolution. And, I think I mentioned before, the Nikolayevich Grand Dukes, they were Pyotr and Nicholas, or Nikolai. They were not really integrated so much with the main branch of the imperial family, with Nicholas and Alexandra. Their father had been a bit of a problematic figure. He'd been, I think, an alcoholic and a gambler who'd lost tons of money, not unlike Dmitri, and he'd had mistresses, and he had been in the doghouse with Alexander III, and had been fired, I think, as he'd been the commander of the St. Petersburg Guards in St. Petersburg military district, a role that his son would subsequently have. But he was, I think, more or less banished from Russia and was not in the Tsar's good graces. And so there were tensions between the sons and between Nicholas II, and they weren't close, although they were not discriminated against. I mean, the son, Nikolasha, was given this prime military role in Russia, and then, in fact, appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian military forces during the First World War. So I don't want to go too much down the rabbit hole, but the brothers Nicholas and Pyotr Nikolayevich were married to two very interesting women, Anastasia and Militsa, princesses of Montenegro, and they were the of a mystical frame of mind, and they were the ones who introduced Rasputin to the imperial court and to Alexandra. They had been on good terms with Alexandra for a little while, and then that relationship soured, but the damage was done because they'd already brought Rasputin to her attention. So they were, let's talk a little bit about them. So Stana, who was Anastasia, was Nikolai Nikolaevich's wife. She was a divorcee. The two of them never had any children. And Militsa was Peter's wife, and she's not mentioned, so I don't know what happened to her. I don't know why she's not in the picture here, if she had passed away, or if she just wasn't there at her brother-in-law's villa. So let's see, what do we know about her? So at that time, Nikolasha was in his 60s, Stana was in her 50s, and she and her sister were two of the 12 children of Nikola I of Montenegro, who'd been the king of this little Balkan state of Montenegro. And he was at that time also in the south of France and in Antibes. And so at some point, Stana has to run off and visit her father because he's in the hospital. By that time, the kingdom of Montenegro either no longer existed or he had been forced to abdicate. At any rate, he's living in Antibes. He's a king in exile, and he's in the hospital there. I don't know what illness he was suffering from, but he would die a couple months later on the 1st of March, 1921. So she goes off to see him, and Dmitri and Pyotr and Nikolasha are left alone to talk about the whole Sokolov investigation. So the family was more or less divided at that time. So you had the Dowager Empress, who was in Denmark and who was who refused to believe that her son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren had been killed, and believed the rumors that her son at least had been seen living this sort of undercover life in Russia, and she didn't want to have anything to do with the Sokolov investigation. So then you have Kirill, who's trying as hard as he can to establish himself as the claimant to the throne and the pretender in exile. And then you have Nikolasha, who sort of, without Maria Fyodorovna being willing to play a role, Nikolasha is sort of the de facto leader of the family, even though he wasn't that high in the succession. He's sort of the grand old man. He was a very serious person. He'd led the Russian military, and he'd had a lot of confidence with general staff and aristocratic circles in Russia before the revolution, and he'd had, in fact, kind of a little dissident group gathered around him. When he was fired as commander-in-chief, he was sent into a sort of semi-exile in the Caucasus. Although he was still a general, he was sort of banished to the Caucasus, and he had this sort of little group of dissidents around him. And Alexandra hated him and saw him as a threat. I don't know if Nicholas saw him as a threat, but anyway, they got him out of the way. And so he had standing in the Russian emigre community, far more than Kirill did. And so this was another focus of legitimacy within the imperial family because of Nicholas being an established leader. So it's important for Dmitri to talk to him. At this time, Dmitri, as we know, is appalled by everything that Kirill is doing and by Kirill himself. And Dmitri very much wants to be the person who takes control of the Sokolov materials. And so he goes to try and get Nicholas Nikolayevich's support. And he's very pleased because he says, openly, he expresses his pleasure that he is treated well and taken seriously by these two brothers. And that was one of the thorns in Dmitri's side for the whole of his existence, going back to his teen years, that people didn't take him seriously. And he wanted more than anything to be taken seriously. We've talked about that. So he's very happy with the reception he gets from the two brothers, who were, decades older than him, and serious people. Well, Nikolai was not so much. Pyotr was kind of a non-entity. So they talk about Sokolov, and Dmitri in the past has recently referred to his idea to have the documents put in a bank vault, with himself as the key holder, although not the owner, of course. And now there's this reference to this idea of forming a committee, and so he lists Orlov, Kochubey, Old Putyatin, Andrei, and himself. It would be a 5-member committee, and there were so many Orlovs and Kochubeys, in fact, multiple ones mentioned in Dmitri's diaries, that even though I have an inkling of who they were, I'm just not going to go into that right now. This is already turning into a lengthy discussion. Old Putyatin, I assume, was Gulya's father, and so at any rate, these were respected members of the emigre community who'd been respected members of the court before the revolution. And so there would be this committee. It would have 2 Grand Dukes on it. And then he makes this odd comment about the idea of concealing the matter in a monastic school. So that, I assume, would be a seminary attached to a monastery. So what does that mean? In Russia, outside of Russia, if we assume it was an Orthodox monastery, which it must have been. So, why would you take documents and conceal them in a seminary. And I think this is something that Dmitri doesn't mention explicitly, but a lot of the reason why these things were being fought over is because they allegedly included one of the Empress's fingers that was found and somehow identified as hers. It wasn't DNA, of course, and that Sokolov had brought this finger out with him from Russia and from his investigation in Yekaterinburg. So was this her finger? I have no idea what the determination was with that, or is with that. It was possible. And so to conceal a finger in a monastery or the school attached to a monastery would make much more sense than concealing documents there, and that wasn't anyway in keeping with Dmitri's idea that the document should be in a bank vault. So I assume that's what he's talking about, and I assume that's also what he's talking about when he says Petusha has this silly idea about that everything being tied into the will and authority of the patriarch. So the patriarch at that time, I don't believe the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia had yet been established. So he's talking about the patriarch Tikhon, who was, oddly enough, I mean, this is a rabbit hole I really can't go down. Peter the Great had abolished the office of Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it had been revived after the revolution. And Tikhon had been appointed by the provisional government, I believe, or by the Holy Synod at the time that the provisional government took over. And then, oddly enough, the Soviets didn't refute that. They didn't kill him. They didn't force him into exile, and they allowed him to remain the patriarch of Moscow. And so apparently they're thinking that the patriarch is the person who should take charge of this finger, and I think there were some bones and other things as well. And so I need to refer to, where did I put it? I need to go back and read the fairly lengthy section on Sokolov in this book, in a chapter called La Vie Éternelle, Le Juge Sokolov, and it's a long multi-page portion of the book that talks about all of these things, and maybe I'll do a separate video on that because it's quite interesting. But if you read French and you can get a copy of this book, dive into it. So let's see, I'm going way too long. So returning to they took me very seriously, so much that at moments it struck me as a little funny. What is that all about, that he thinks it's funny that they're taking him seriously? And the words for strange and humorous are not the same in Russian. So he is saying that it's a little comical. Well, that's so typical of Dmitri and his ability to detach himself from things a little bit. I'm sure if they had not taken him seriously and they hadn't treated him well, that he would have called that funny as well. Okay, then there's this awkward scene with Andrei in the car where he's in tears, which seemed to be something that happened fairly frequently with Andrei. And so with tears in his eyes, he proclaimed his love for me and asked that we never argue. I would add the word again, because they'd had some rough times recently. Specifically, Dmitri had heard about Andrei saying nasty things about him behind his back, but that's all resolved, and Andrei is so touched by the fact that Maria has received him and his wife, or at least made a gesture toward receiving them, and apparently he's giving Dmitri some of the credit for that. And then, so they go back and they have this pleasant evening at the Villa Alam. Dmitri spends the night there, and the only thing that's a little bit of a fly in the ointment, he writes, except that Malichka tried too hard to lead me like a little lamb. and I'm not sure what he means by that. I don't think that she herself was making a pass at him, but in the last time he referred to them, he said that she was sort of overtly playing the role of pimp in relation to this young woman that she'd brought to the house for dinner that evening. So was this young woman back? I don't know. Dmitri doesn't mention her, but it's hard to picture Dmitri being led like a little lamb at any rate. So he's still suspicious of Malia, although he has sort of switched from Malia to Malichka. So now she's getting a little more of an affectionate nickname. Well, very, very interesting stuff. Thank you for bearing with me. I've now been going for a half an hour, and yeah, keep coming back. I haven't looked ahead at the 3rd of January. I have a feeling Dmitri will be leaving Monte Carlo pretty soon, if memory serves me, because I have already translated these early months of 1921. And yeah, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.